donors, but right there in telling the story of human sexual reproduction, we talked about sperm and ova, right? We talked about there being a male sex cell and a female sex cell, and does that matter?
Yeah.
Are they interchangeable?
No.
Very much not, right? For human sexual reproduction to work, you have to have an ovum, so a female sex cell, impregnated by a sperm, a male sex cell, right? And that is a requirement. It doesn't work if two ova interact or if two sperm interact. So that tells us something right there, that sexual dimorphism refers to, well, sexual refers to related to sex or sexual reproduction, and then di refers to what as a prefix? To morphism. Morph refers to
Me. Please.
Yep.
What morphism? I think it's like physical traits.
Yeah, very good. Well, yeah, very good. We'll say morphos refers to shape or form, which in this case, absolutely. In this case, we're absolutely going to take to mean traits. Very good. So traits, and then di means two, right? And then sexual refers to organisms that reproduce sexually. So in sexual dimorphism, we have organisms that reproduce sexually that have two different shapes, forms, or sets of traits. Does that make sense? Are humans sexually dimorphic?
Yes.
Yeah. Both at what we call the primary level. So when we talk about the primary sex characteristics, we're talking about things directly related to reproduction. In other words, the reproductive systems of human males and human females are fundamentally different, right? We have reproductive tracts that have different forms, different functions, and fulfill different purposes. And then we have all of what we call the secondary sex characteristics, which don't actually have anything to do directly with reproduction, but are still associated with the male and female body form, right? And these relate in every way differently from different general heights, different general shoulder widths, general breadths, the development of breasts and mammary tissues in females, right? The female sex organs and the male sex organs are generally considered part of the primary sex trait, but there's all these other things that change during puberty that we think of as being part of the secondary sex characteristics, right? And that can be everything from men typically having a deeper voice, women typically having a higher voice, and all these things. Important to understand that all of these things exist along a normal curve, and when we talk about dimorphism, it tends to be that the average value of one gender is different from the average value of another gender. Does that mean that no person who's biologically male has a higher voice than somebody who's biologically female? Of course not, right? There's variation. Does it mean that there's no male who's shorter than a biologically female individual? Of course not. What we're saying isn't then that things are radically different, but rather that the average value is different. And that's an important way to think, because there's variation amongst everything, not just within the secondary sex characteristics. We're even going to find that the primary sex characteristics exist across a spectrum. But the definition of things that are sexually dimorphic then are things that have two sets of sex cells, so two distinct sex cells. Male and female. Now, interestingly, that isn't enough to make something sexually dimorphic. Plants have two distinct sets of cells, male and female, and yet most plants are not sexually dimorphic. There are actually some plants where there's a male and female, but that is atypical. Mostly speaking, all plants have both the male sex parts and the female sex parts. It's typically true of plants. It's typically not true of people, though it's also never true of people, which is important to remember. So in our case, that would be spermatozoa and ova. Right? Sperm and egg, sort of in the more pejorative sense. But it also, two distinct body types. These share most major features. though often with different average values. In other words, in humans, the male and the female body plan are drastically more similar than they are different, right? I mean, if you think of somebody who's biologically male and somebody who's biologically female, overwhelmingly your traits are the same. You have a nose. That nose has two nostrils. You have two eyes. There's eyebrows above that. There's eyelashes on that when your eyelids close. You have two ears, right? You have the same number of bones. You have like everything is fundamentally the same with a very small number of changes, though even in those things that are fundamentally the same, you can probably think of things that are typically different. Is there a difference in the typical, say, nose of somebody who's biologically male and biologically female? Yeah, you would say that typically people who are biologically male have a slightly larger and broader nose, but that's not always true, right? Is there something typically true about, any of these things? And again, there may be distinct average differences, but that doesn't mean we're talking about different traits altogether. Does that make sense? But we do have that there's major differences typically in what we call the primary sex traits. So the primary sex traits are those related to reproduction. All right, for example, what are the primary sex organs of the male reproductive system? Well, the penis and the testes, and then everything that goes on sort of to support those underneath, right? Whereas in the female, primary sex organs are the uterus, and the uterus would be roughly equivalent. I mean, I guess really the ovaries would be more distinctly directly related to the testes. There isn't really an equivalent in the uterus to the uterus in men because, of course, what don't men have to do? They don't have to carry a baby around at any point, and it's a pretty good deal if you ask me. Your mileage may vary. But the external sex organs of the female reproductive system, right, the vagina. So these are what we call the primary sex traits or the primary sex characteristics. Secondary sex traits are typical differences in body shapes and proportion. Right? Typically broader shoulders for men, typically broader hips for women. Typically greater height for males, typically shorter height for females. Typically lower voice for males, typically higher voice for females. These things aren't directly related to sex, but they seem to be tied to biological sex. So biological sex determination happens how? What determines whether you are biologically male or biologically female? That is the definition of what it means to be male or female, which body plan you have. What determines that? What determines whether you have a penis and testes or whether you have a vagina and ovaries and whether you have all those typical secondary sex characteristics? Yeah.
I don't know the scientific word for it.
Okay.
Just gonna say this again. Is it area of the sperm? Like, as in whatever. I don't know.
No, you're spot on in wondering. It is absolutely the sperm determines the sex of the offspring. We'll talk about why that is typically true in a man. It's not always true, but typically that's actually right. The sperm is the sex cell of the parents that determines the typical biological sex of the offspring. Yeah. Yep.
Babies that are made from like bone marrow, how do they determine what gender it is?
That's a great question. It's a great question. And put a pin in it. We're going to come back to it, okay? Yes.
Is it chromosomes that determine it? Doesn't it?
Is it chromosomes? And what chromosomes do we associate with being biologically male?
I don't know actually.
Ah. Does anyone know what the default body plan in humans is? I'm going to start by saying this. Sex determination, i.e., is an offspring male or is that offspring female, varies from species to species. For animals, the basic body plan is actually females. So for animals, the basic body plan is female. And it takes intervention along the way to have an offspring be male instead of female. So the male body plan is a variation on this. Every person in this room who is biologically female has in the genetic code all of the genes responsible for making male sex parts as well. And every person in this room who is biologically male has inside their genetic code all of the genes required to make the female body plan. It is not the case that if you're biologically male, you only have the genes for the male body plan, and if you're biologically female, you only have the genes for the female body plan. You have both. You have both. And, like I said, the default body plan is female. It takes hormone intervention during development to determine the biological sex of an offspring. That's true for every animal, including humans. So hormone levels during development determine biological sex. So hormone levels, i.e. the ratio of primarily, what are the two sex hormones that we think of? Yep. Estrogen and testosterone and others. In other words, regardless of what somebody's chromosomal makeup is, if we were to intervene during development, you could intervene simply by changing the ratio of hormones, which could be done, the same way you could take pills for hormones. Obviously, doing that for a baby in utero requires a little bit more work getting it in there, but still, just changing that ratio of hormones would change whether somebody's body develops to be a male body or a female body, regardless of what their genes say. Because again, your body contains all of the genes required to produce a penis and testes and all of the other vas deferens and all these other parts that make up the male sex organs. And your body contains all of the genes required to produce the vagina and the vulva and all of the things associated with the female sex organs. Yeah.
I'm just double checking. That's a T and H, right?
A which?
And something. I read it as a K actually.
This here? That's the word others. So that was a TH. But I got your back. Is that better? Cool. Yep.
So, first, for the thing where...
First, whoa, you don't get two. Give me one. Go.
Oh, sorry. The male body plan is a variation of the female body. Is that for, like, humans?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so in development, everybody starts out as female. So In the first few weeks of development in utero, there's precisely zero difference in development between people who are biologically male and people who are biologically female. And then the differences extend from there. And every male sex organ is simply the female sex organs that already exist, but developing further. So in terms of histology, has anyone ever heard of histology before? This is the study of tissues. So in terms of histology, in terms of tissues, the penis and the clitoris are the exact same developmental tissues. One is obviously just far more developed than the other, right? The testes and the ovaries are the same tissues that have developed, but they've just developed in different locations. Of course, when men are born, the testicles actually aren't in their final location, or sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't at birth, but during development, the testes start up much higher in the body, just like the ovaries, and they actually have to descend down into the scrotum, right? And the scrotum is just the same tissue that makes up the perineum in a female that is just grown out and extended. So it's the exact same body plan, but simply with different things developed in different ways and modified. Does that make sense?
It's just outwards.
A modification of the same body plan. This is an important thing to understand for a couple of reasons. One, it's an important thing to understand because this fits with how evolutionary biology works, right? In evolutionary biology, somebody hasn't sat down and designed a new organism or designed a new species. Our understanding is that these changes evolved and changed over time, and we got developments. And in the animal kingdom, as sexual dimorphism developed, it wasn't the case that somebody sat down and sketched out this is going to be a male, this is going to be a female, but rather that these traits just naturally diverged. And the further back in time you go, evolutionarily speaking, sort of the smaller those differences would be in sex characteristics, right? It's taken time for them to develop into that. Humans have relatively subtle sex variations compared to a lot of other animals. Birds are a big one. Often in birds there are massive differences in the traits of male and females. This is true in the insect world too, actually. We often see very, very big differences. In humans, it's relatively subtle, right? I mean, we're not talking about massive differences, certainly as viewed from sort of, across a room or something like that. In other words, the average male and the average female could disguise one for another with relative ease in the human world. Try that if you're a cardinal, right? Where one of you has bright red feathers and the other dark gray feathers, or a peacock, right? Where one of you just, the male peacock has these wild, ridiculous, like incredibly colorful feathers, and then like the peahen just doesn't at all, right? Like she's just, boring old bird walking around, right? A lot harder to disguise one for the other. Do you imagine if every guy just had massive colorful feathers growing out of his butt? It'd be a pretty wild thing, right?
That'd be fabulous.
And like that's how they attracted girls, just like, look at my massive colorful feathers growing right out of my butt. And you'd be like, look at the massive colorful feathers growing out of that guy's butt. That's incredible. I'm so attracted to him right now. It'd be weird, right? That'd be weird, but in birds, that's how they do it. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know what to tell you. So, but that's important to understand the idea of sex determination because that's the thing that is regulated. So this is regulated in a number of different ways. And somebody's already said it, but in humans, how is this regulated? In other words, in humans, what determines, by and large, whether an individual is biologically male or biologically female? So we said, all right, chromosomes. And what are the chromosomes involved? Yeah, so we control it chromosomally, right? Chromosomally. In our case, we have an X and Y chromosome. And we'll talk about what that looks like in just a minute. But what else? Does anyone know how crocodiles determine sex? Yeah. Temperature specifically of what? Yeah, very good. The temperature of the eggs. Which means that the eggs that are on sort of the outer ring will tend to have a different temperature than those that are held inside. And so like that determines which ones are more likely to develop into male crocodilians and which into female crocodilians. There are other ways as well. I'm not going to go through all of them. We'll say, and others. But again, that is not regulating sex directly, all right? Rather, that is regulating the hormone levels, and the hormone levels regulate biological sex. Does that make sense? That's an important distinction, because what genes do you imagine are on the Y chromosome, given what it codes for? Remind me, what does the Y chromosome code for? No, because we said the base body plan is female, right? So presumably the Y chromosome then has like the penis gene on it, like the testicle gene on it, and sperm production gene and all that jazz, would we assume? Yeah, but it doesn't have any of that on it. It has none of that on it. In fact, the Y chromosome, A, codes for basically nothing. It basically has one working gene on it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It is a degraded copy of the X chromosome that has just degraded over time. And interestingly, it's disappearing with each generation. It keeps shrinking. It's still got some life left in it, but it's interesting. Scientists are keenly aware of the fact that the Y chromosome is degrading, and that this happens in nature with lots of other animals. For lots of other animals, they no longer have a chromosomal difference between male and female, and that simply isn't how sex determination happens. The Y chromosome is a chromosome that basically contains a single gene. So we're going to talk about that.
So it's kind of slightly pointless?
Well, no, it's not pointless, because our survival as a species currently depends on having people who are biologically female and biologically male. Doesn't matter for an individual. For any given individual, does not matter if you're male or female. On a species-wide scale, real important to have some of each, right? Right? Like that. You know what they say? Men can't live with them. Can't procreate and carry forward the species without them. That's what they say, right?
Just die off.
That's sarcasm.
That's not fair though. How can two women be pregnant, not two men?
Well, they can't. Outside of medical intervention, and with medical intervention, all kinds of things can be done. And we'll get to that. So anyway, shh, quiet. So, as you know, humans have 22 autosomal chromosomes. In other words, 22 chromosomes that have nothing to do with being male or female. The X chromosome is the 23rd. Right, chromosome 23 is the X chromosome. And a few things to note about it. One is that it's short-ish. It's not one of our longer chromosomes. It has thousands of genes, as opposed to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. So it has thousands of genes, and most of these are unrelated to sex. The Y chromosome is actually a degraded copy of the X chromosome from many, 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 many generations past. What are we working on back there? You stealing my analytical balance?
Yeah, we are. It's revision.
Oh, okay. Take good care of it, please.
We will.
Depending on how you count, it contains only a handful of genes. And there's really only one set of genes that is really meaningful or notable. So it contains a handful of genes, notably one called SRY. Just give me a sec, okay? Okay, and we're going to note SRY activates testosterone release during development. And this typically results in what? And this typically results in male offspring. In other words, typically if somebody has the Y chromosome, then during their development the SRY gene is expressed, and if the SRY gene is expressed, that will release testosterone during development, which is typically going to result in somebody who's biologically male. Now, interestingly, like anything else, the amount of expression of SRY exists again on what we call that normal curve, where the average biologically male person will see this much expression of it, and will have sort of average levels of secondary sex characteristics. And then greater expression of that can result in greater sexual differences and things like that. But notably, some people who are biologically male and even have this gene happen to express it at a very low level. So the people who have a Y chromosome, who have an SRY gene that simply isn't used very much, and they never produce much testosterone, which means they don't produce many in the way of secondary sex characteristics or primary sex characteristics, and they will, for all intents and purposes, be biologically female. This happens in a small percentage of times, 1 or 2%, but it happens. So somewhere between 0.1% and 1% of people who are biologically female out there, and it's hard to know because we obviously don't genetically test, we don't do chromosomal tests on every single living person, right? But estimates say around about 1 in 1,000 people who are biologically female actually have a Y chromosome, but have absolutely no male sex characteristics. By the way, the testosterone levels can potentially be raised for other reasons, and a lower percentage, but a meaningful percentage still, of people who are biologically male do not have a Y chromosome. And then you get cases that are stranger still, where upwards of up in the range of as much as 4% of offspring, it's ambiguous. In other words, they will have both some male and some female sex characteristics at birth. In the 1960s and 50s and 40s, do you know what they used to do when a baby was born? They would tell mom and dad, pick. And then they'd, get the scissors out. Yeah, and that was just what was done. In recent years, there's been a change of habit where they say, why don't we just wait and see what happens? Wait and see how this person sort of develops and what seems to come as they hit puberty, and you can sort of figure that out then. But that's only, in your lifetime that change has been made. And again, this is a substantial number of people. And I think that's important because, listen, there are two elements to sex and gender, and this is not a lesson about, this isn't a sociology class, and that it's a politics class, it's not any of these things. But there's two distinct things, one of which we're talking about in this class, one of which has absolutely nothing to do with this class. And this is, again, one of these is a biological term, one of these is a sociological term. Which is which?
Sex is a biological term.
Yeah.
Gender is
Great.
sociological.
Sex is a biological term. It refers to body parts. It refers to that. Even sex determination, as you can see here, isn't cut and dried. You see people say all the time when they're having, again, something I have no interest in having right now, a political discussion about these things, but they'll say things like, gender is binary. It's either, and first of all, you're not talking about gender. You're talking about sex, because those are two different things. But even then, they'll say gender is binary. You're either male or female. And it's not that simple. It's not that simple. Gender is binary. We're here talking about sexual dimorphism. But like so many things in life, binary is like how computers work. It's either on or off. That's not how human systems work. Human systems always work along a gradient. And the truth is, sex is a game of average values, just like anything else. It's normal curves. And where do all of these people live? They live where normal curves intersect, right? And these are real human beings, and they're real people. So whatever your political opinions may be, or this or that, it's important to understand that there is overlap in terms of sex. It just isn't, it simply isn't as cut and dry. What do you say about somebody who's born with a clitoris, a vagina, and a penis? That happens. Is that binary and simple to sort out? I don't think it is. And that's a real human being who's going to be born and who's going to, have a childhood and adolescence and fall in love. And that person exists, and they deserve consideration in these things as much as anyone else, right? And every other variation throughout. So that's really important. And then as to gender, which is, all of the behavioral things that we associate with being male and female, that has, I'm not going to say nothing to do with biology, because of course it does. If you study animal science, you're going to learn about the behavior of the males of a species and the behaviors of the females of a species, and that's all gender stuff. That has nothing to do with their body parts. That has to do with how they do and behave. And is some of that baked in genetically? Definitely. Is all of it baked in genetically? Definitely not. Do we know exactly where one half of that ends and the other begins? No. And but I just want to mention that when people try to use science to sort of say anything is cut and dried, let me tell you what science is never. Cut and dried, especially biology. Of all the sciences, biology deals with living systems. And look at me, you, one organism, just one organism, are made up of kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of DNA stuffed inside of hundreds of trillions of cells and just billions of systems working together. Nothing is cut and dried, and you're just one living thing. You live in a world full of trillions and trillions of living things. Very complex systems. And that's all I have to say about any of it, but just very important to note. I'm reticent to take questions right now because I may answer them, and today's a longer lesson. So just put your hand down, and if by the end I haven't got to it, then ask, okay? When we talk about the chromosomal arrangements, there's two possible ones. What are the two possible chromosomal genotypes? We know that you can have an X chromosome and an X chromosome, right? In which case, this person would lack the SRY gene, right? Because where's SRY found?
In Y.
On chromosome Y. And so typically, this person will be female. Okay. What is the other chromosomal arrangement one could have? X and Y, right? And then this has SRY, which means that typically this person will be male. Why isn't there a third combination? We have homozygous X and we have heterozygous. Why don't we have homozygous Y?
Since you said like the Y chromosome is just the X chromosome like degraded.
Yeah.
Like it won't work as well as XX because it's a degraded version.
Yeah, you're just simply missing genes that are required for life. The X chromosome contains necessary information, so YY isn't possible because they'd be missing genes, right? There are necessary genes on X. There are no necessary genes for life on Y, but there are necessary genes for life on X. So now, I think we already answered this. Which parent determines the sex of the offspring? In humans. If you're biologically male and you always wish you'd been biologically female, or if you have a baby sister and you wish you'd had a baby brother, which parent do you need to blame? Yeah, and why? If you have mom, regardless of what other gene she has, what is her sex chromosome arrangement? What does she have for sure? X and X, which means when mom makes ova, she either passes on her X chromosome here, or she passes on her X chromosome there, and in either case, she has passed on X. And then the father, well, what's his chromosomal arrangement? He's XY, which means he either passes on his X chromosome or he passes on his Y chromosome. If one of his sperm that has an X chromosome in it meets one of mom's ova, we get, which means that this offspring will be biologically female. Likewise, here we're going to get
Female.
a female. But here we will get
Male.
male, and here we will get male. So your biological father is responsible for your biological gender. And all your siblings' biological genders, assuming they have the same biological father. All of your full siblings. Lots of people have half siblings, right?
What'd you,
Then it could be some guy named Gary who's responsible for your siblings' biological gender. I don't know.
When you said that, you kind of pointed to me.
Did I?
Yeah, you.
No, I just went like this. I just like this. No, I was busy trying to think of a funny name for the biological father I was going to go with, and I decided on Gary. I feel good about that. Anyway, Gary feels like a stepdad name to me.
Yeah.
You know, I never had a stepdad, but I feel like if you have a stepdad, there's good odds his name's going to be Gary or like Frank. Obviously, any name could be a stepdad's name, but when you think of like in a movie, like stepdad's name in a movie, John, like I feel like there's a lot. Paul. I feel like Paul might be the one actually. Now that you mention it,
Yeah.
Paul has real stepdad energy.
Or Greg, I feel.
Greg, yeah, I can see it.
We're set up for failure.
Sorry.
Be a stepdad.
Well, listen, it's an important role and one that you hope people will do well, right? Stepdad, important job. And I imagine an awkward one. So I never had a stepdad. I've also never been a stepdad. But I feel like that's a weird role to step into because you got to like take on some of that parenting role, but without like assuming that somebody now thinks of you as a parent because probably at first they don't, right?
Yeah, my brother's that way.
Right? Like I feel like that's actually got to be a pretty tricky. I feel like that's a tricky thing to weave through.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to put this in case we didn't note it. So the father's sperm determines the sex of the offspring. Okay, so that is the basic primer on sexual dimorphism. Again, important to understand that all those genes, everything required for the others there. This is why hormone therapy is possible, right? This is why by changing the balance of somebody's internal hormones, even later on in adolescence and adulthood, you can change the secondary sex characteristics. My grandfather famously spent 2 months accidentally taking my grandmother's estrogen from when she was going through menopause instead of his own pills because he got his pill bottle switched. And yeah, and he became incredibly moody. Because again, when your hormones change, as you know, right? Like you've all either at some point in your recent years gone through puberty and gone through like the big hormonal shifts of that. And anytime you go through big hormonal shifts, usually that affects your mood pretty dramatically, and fair enough, right? Like your brain chemistry is changing in real time. This is also true, both males and females have a hormone cycle. Obviously, women are more keenly aware of those because it's tied to like a physical cycle as well, right? Like so there's the development of the uterine lining and the shedding of the uterine lining, and that makes it obvious that you are going through a monthly hormonal cycle. But men too have a hormonal cycle on which they're on, and their moods vary with it as well. Yeah.
There's a study that most males go through the same 24-hour cycle throughout the day, and that females go through a month.
Yeah, that's right.
Huh.
It's interesting stuff. And again, these things vary, right? As most women can tell you, some women's like menstrual cycles are like you could build a calendar around, and then some women's menstrual cycles are just like wildly all over the place, right? And some women, I mean, depending on nutrition, depending on diet, depending on genetics, some women's menstrual cycle stress. Some women's menstrual cycles will cease for like months on end, right? Like there's just massive variation there. And again, I cannot stress enough, whenever you're talking about biological systems, you are talking about average values that vary dramatically. And that is important to know. But that covers sex and sexuality for this course. Though when we get to organ systems, we'll talk a little bit about our reproductive systems again. But there's a different set of things, and these are called sex-linked traits, but sex-linked, not sex traits. What is a sex-linked trait? Does anyone know? What about X and Y chromosomes?
Specifically affects those.
Hmm?
Specifically affects those ones.
Affects those chromosomes or
Not
is
affects, but is like
affected by
They're getting
who's
close
gonna go?
on me.
Did you ever in elementary school do one of these things where like you went to a computer lab and you all wrote a story and it'd be like 2 minutes and then like they'd like blow a whistle or something and you had to move to the computer next to you and carry on with their
No.
story? Did you never do this?
No.
Oh, it was
That
super
so
fun.
No.
We used to do that in school, and so like by the end, everyone had written every story, like everyone had participated in. You need a good group of people to do it, because if you've got losers, then it just gets awful quickly. But if everyone involved is approaching it sincerely, it's actually a really cool exercise and really fun.
Can we do that
Um,
in order for you?
no, you know my policy on fun. Don't believe in it. Never been a fan. You know what? That actually would be a cool idea for a lab report, wouldn't it?
That would be terrifying. That'd be terrifying.
That would actually be pretty neat.
Terrifying.
Anyway,
Terrifying.
what was that? Oh, that's because we're going around. A sex-linked trait. A sex-linked trait is a trait that is linked to sex, not because it has anything to do with sex, but because the gene that controls it is located on which chromosome? X and Y?
Mainly no.
Yeah, just X. Because what doesn't Y contain? Anything, really. Y is a junk chromosome. Again, it basically has it has a few genes, but it has one working set of genes, and those genes basically say like, hey, produce a bunch of testosterone during development, and that's it, right? So sex-linked traits are traits related to genes on the X chromosome. So why even bother mentioning this? Well, it's important actually. Why did I say? Oh yeah, I related. Sorry. See, this is what happens when I speak and write at the same time. So these are traits controlled by genes on the X chromosome.
Isn't the Y chromosome like slowly degrading over generation?
It is, yeah. So let's use an example. Does anyone know the most sort of famous example of a sex-linked trait? Very good, red-green color blindness. So this is found on the X chromosome, and when it's found on the X chromosome, we have to make note of that if we're going to try to track genetics. So we're not just going to say big N for normal color vision. We're going to say X big N refers to normal color vision.
Wow.
And then we have X little n referring to color blindness. And again, we're talking specifically red-green color blindness here. And then, what is the third possible allele, of course? Yep. Y, which is nothing, right? It doesn't code for anything with regards to this. It just doesn't have anything to do with it. There is no color blindness gene on the Y chromosome, which means what are the possible genotypes? Yep.
Can you scroll up a tiny bit?
I would love to. Is that enough?
Yes.
What are the possible genotypes? You could have big X normal and big X normal. What else could you have? You could have big X normal, big X colorblind, yeah. You could have big X colorblind, big X colorblind. Okay. In all cases, these are, bless you, these are all female. And what would their experience be? The fact that this is a lowercase n means that this trait is recessive. In other words, it's just a broken copy of the cone cell gene. So if you have one copy, you're good, which means this is dominant. Which means this person here and this person here will both have what trait? Normal vision. And this person, colorblind, right? But there's two more possible genotypes. What are they? X normal Y, and X colorblind Y. These are both biologically male. But in this case, this person would be colorblind, and this person would have normal color vision. Does that make sense? So let's just do old Punnett square, shall we?
Sure. Why not?
It's honestly not
Why
that
not?
bad. It's honestly not that bad.
I know, I'm just tired. I'm just tired.
No, just do it.
I'm gonna get to go to sleep soon.
Okay, so let's imagine a colorblind mom and a normal father have children. Is crossed with. Which, again, it feels fine when you're talking about like plants or even like fruit flies. As soon as you talk about people, that just feels like a rather disrespectful way to refer to mating. Like, oh man, did you hear about so and so and so? Yeah, oh, I hear they were crossed. Do you know what I mean? Like, it just, you probably shouldn't have said that. Anyway. No. Anyway. Listen, I didn't use names or anything, right? But yes.
Is registered colorblindness not a genetic mutation?
It is. Yep, it absolutely is. But again, it is a mutation of a gene that's found on the X chromosome. So it absolutely is, and it is a genetic disease. It's a recessive genetic disease, but the fact that it is sex-linked makes it behave a little more oddly than normal genetic diseases, because it will affect females differently than it will affect males. And we're going to look at this example here. So a colorblind mother is crossed with a normal father, and we're going to ask the usual question: what do their offspring look like, right? So describe the F1 generations, genotypic and phenotypic frequencies. Genotypic and phenotypic frequencies. Oh, wait, you know what I can do? I never think to do this, but I have the power. There we go. But you know what? I need a bit more space, don't I? You know, this isn't going well. I have regrets.
You do.
Who just said that? Well played. I gotta be honest, I did not like that better than the way I normally do it. That's okay, you live, you learn. I hate this. You know what? I'm happening, unfortunately. That appears to be the problem. Oh, God. Oh, they're not happy about it up there. Like, I didn't like that Punnett square. Thwack! I assume they listened to all my lessons online.
Me.
Like,
Oh,
This is some interesting
I have a love friend. Lord.
someone's very cross right now, but not crossed. Anyway. Okay. See, that was problematic. Anyway, we'll move on. Okay.
Maybe don't do that.
Yeah, no, yeah,
Maybe
no.
don't.
Okay.
It was funny, but at what cost?
We spent so much time wondering if we could. If we could, we didn't think if we should. Anyway.
I feel so left out right now because I didn't get it. So I think I'm gonna have to watch the lesson.
Anyway, so
God, please.
I want you to take 2 minutes and figure this out yourself. We normally put the mother up here, right? We put maternal up here. We put the paternal over here. You know how to do a Punnett square at this point. This isn't even a dihybrid cross. This is just a good old-fashioned monohybrid cross. We're looking at one trait: color vision.
the Jeopardy music?
I should.
That'd be
You know,
fun.
at some point I should learn that on guitar. There's got to be somebody. I'm not good at coming up with like finger style arrangements, but somebody has to have figured out like a nice finger style arrangement, like the Jeopardy theme song. The do 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 do.
It sounds like you're playing it in like a different key right now.
Alright, there you go.
Okay, okay.
Okay, focus on your work.
No.
Keep practicing.
I know I'm forgetting the N.
Put in the ends. We can't get the A's in unless it comes down.
I know.
Yeah, mine stopped.
Oh yeah, so she does.
Okay,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
when
so
I
she
do
would
it's
have.
okay.
No, that's normal, so she'd have an N.
I don't know.
But
Okay, all right.
no.
That's gonna have to be a project now.
No, that's
It's
That's
so
what it
much
is, like,
easier,
my-
guys.
Right? Yeah, no, amazing. But then,
No,
like,
this is the only
first you find the melody, then once you found the melody, you work some chords around it, and then you like get jazzy, right?
Since he's
Before you know it, I'll be like,
Do a jazz dance while
Oh,
doing
yeah,
that.
so-
That way we don't know.
see, like that right there is just a major triad.
Oh wait, So
Right?
they're colorblind, right?
So those are just the three
Yeah.
notes of the chord,
Ignore
like a
this.
major triad.
Severely.
Okay, that's why you write them up here. Because then you know what you're working with. We went to the same dance class. I can't really take it.
Yay!
Bro, what are you thirsty?
So what do you notice?
Colorblind.
Okay, but who's colorblind? Nobody.
Oh wait, no, that's normal, so there's two.
Are you done your lesson? I have a question.
Yep.
No,
Oh,
I have two actually.
Go for it.
Can you come here so you can look at what I'm asking? How does 188 produce?
Remind me, very normal N.
Like where's how do you get 3 hydrogens out of it?
Because it passes electrons on here, but the electrons move all the way through here. So the electrons get passed on here from one hydrogen here, a second one there,
You're
and a
going
third
like
one.
right on and off.
So one NADH is able to drive the
So
whole chain.
they have, you know,
Since
extreme
NADH
one thing is
enters after
they
It
that,
posted
doesn't
on
matter
this
how
list.
many hydrogens are in it.
Yeah, I looked at it.
Nope.
You're on like
No, it's not moving its
Yeah,
hydrogens.
go-
It's just
go
moving
with it right
hydrogens.
there.
It's the energy. All right, talk to me, Mom. What's her genotype? What's Mom's genotype?
X little n.
X little n
Yeah.
and X little n. All right, cool. Which means when she goes to make ova, either she's going to pass on her first diseased chromosome, or she's going to pass on her second diseased chromosome.
Wow.
Right? No matter what, she doesn't have a copy of the gene that's normal, right? I've colored them differently just so we can kind of track them. You certainly don't have to. What about Dad? What's he going to pass on?
X.
Either he's going to pass on a normal copy of the X chromosome, or he's going to pass on
Y.
Y, right? Because he's biologically male, he has one of each. So we could say he's either going to pass on X big N, or he's going to pass on Y. All right, in this case, if these two come together, what do we get? X big N, X little n. That's not a very good looking capital N. I'm going to try that again. And this one would be what we call a carrier. What's it mean to be a carrier? It means that phenotypically you're normal, but you do carry a copy of the disease gene. Does that make sense? But phenotypically you are normal. What about this offspring?
Big X.
Big N.
Little N.
Yeah. And who did it get the big N from? Dad, and it got the little n from Mom in both cases. So same thing, we would say this person is a carrier, but they're still normal. genotypically, they may be a carrier, but phenotypically, they are normal. There's no way to distinguish them without looking at their genes from somebody who has two good copies. You only need one good copy of this gene to have good color vision. Okay, but what about here? What does dad pass on?
Y.
What do they get from mom?
Little n.
Little n and big Y. And little n and
Y.
big Y, which means colorblind. If your mom is colorblind, if you're biologically female, if your dad isn't colorblind, you will have normal vision. You'll be a carrier, but you will have normal vision. If your mom is colorblind and your dad has normal vision and you're a male, you will be colorblind. A rare case where this goes the other way. It always feels like women get the short end of the sort of, biological stick in these things, but here we go. This is it's a woman's world here because 100% of the female offspring have normal vision. So in this case, generally speaking, if you're a male and you're colorblind, who do you blame?
Mom.
Well, we've said both the possibilities now. Waiting for someone to say God, and we'll have all three possibilities covered. God, I guess definitely, by definition, almighty controller of the universe, providential in all things. But outside of blaming God, who do we blame? Mom, right? Why? Because she's the one who has to have given you your gene. Because if you're a male, how many copies of the X chromosome do you have? One. And from whom do you get it? Mom. So anything that's on the X chromosome. So interestingly, gentlemen in this room, any sex-linked traits that you have, interestingly, your mother is responsible for them. Weird to think about that, right? Now again, sex-linked doesn't mean your sex characteristics. Though, keep in mind that mom is still responsible for half of all, as weird as this is to say, but every biologically male person in the room, half of the genes that have to do with your penis and your ovary, and your testicles and your ovaries if you have them, and all your other sex characteristics come from your mom as well. Her male secondary sex characteristic genes have been passed on to you even though she doesn't express them. Likewise, if you're biologically female in this room, half of your sex characteristics come from dad, because again, those things aren't housed on the X and Y chromosome. They are just spread throughout the genome all over the place. Does that make sense? So this is a new wrinkle, one last thing we have to talk about, which is that when genes are found on the sex chromosomes, we have to consider that when determining what the outcome will be, because half of the offspring involved will have two copies of that gene as normal, but half of the offspring will only have one copy, and that obviously changes the math. Does that make sense? Does anyone know any other sex-linked diseases? There's another famous one that affected the royal families of Europe. Yes, hemophilia. And if there's ever been a meaner name for a disease, first of all, what's heme a prefix for? Comes from the Latin blood. Philia, of course, is Latin for, so hemophiliacs are, if you take the name at face value, blood-loving. Well, that's a mean name for a disease where what is true about hemophiliacs? Does anyone know? Does anyone know? Yeah.
I don't want you if your blood doesn't really clot.
Yeah, their blood doesn't clot properly, so even a small cut can be life-threatening because they'll simply continue to bleed. Now, can you imagine somebody having that condition? They're like, we need to name this thing. Yeah, blood lovers. Do you know what I'm saying? That is frankly cruel. Yeah.
Didn't Genghis Khan have that?
Sorry?
Didn't Genghis Khan have that?
I don't know. I've never heard that, but it's certainly possible. But like, yeah, the European royal families, it was extremely common. Of course, because they all interbred, it just kept getting passed around. But it affected dramatically more men in the royal family than women because it's a sex-linked trait. It's found on the X chromosome. So for a woman to be a hemophiliac, she has to stop. So for a woman to be a hemophiliac, she has to have 2 copies of a diseased chromosome, right? Whereas for a man to be diseased, he only has to have 1. So as you can imagine, that is far more common than the other. All right, that's the last full lesson in this unit. Tomorrow we'll start looking at the review process and what that looks like, and start sort of winding up to finishing this unit on a strong note. We're gonna finish strong, right? That's important. And we've got a few days. We might even potentially push the test to Monday. We'll see as we get going. Hold up. Well, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Like, because again, you're always robbing Peter to pay Paul.
What?
You get an extra day now. It just means you don't get an extra day later, right? Like, well, that's fine. Maybe there's harder stuff later. Do you know what I mean? Like, that is one thing to keep in mind. Time is a finite quantity. We only have so much of it. This is true not just in school, but I hate to tell you, in life. One day, you'll be dead. Then you'll have no more time here. But in the meantime, you're alive, and we will see as the week goes on where we're going to put our test. But the reason I finish the lessons days before we have test day is so that you have time to review and look at that material. Make sure you're doing so. All right? Have I gone on my rant